So we're probably a couple of minutes past one. We might kick off and people can continue to join the webinar. Firstly, welcome to the webinar today. My name is Jared Brodie. I'm the chair of the Consumers Federation of Australia, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting the webinar today on behalf of the Consumers Federation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're variously meeting on the land of our First Nations people. For me, I'm on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people and the Kulin Nation. The Dja Dja Wurrung people are the traditional owners of the areas covering central northwest Victoria, including Bendigo, Goldfields, Mount Alexander and Hepburn. So I'm in Hepburn Springs today. I'd like to acknowledge their continuing custodianship and ownership of this land for many centuries, and recognise their ongoing connection, including ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal. I'd like to pay respects to any elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people who may be joining us today. So thank you for joining this webinar on e-commerce and the World Trade Organization, implications for Australia and consumer protection. At the outset, I think we can all acknowledge that COVID-19 has meant a significant growth in the digital marketplace, where moreover, increasingly this e-commerce is happening across borders into different countries. It's obviously great for consumers, providing us access to goods and services and choice, but purchasing goods and services online and from overseas can pose consumer risks in areas such as pricing, payment systems, dispute resolution, among others. Of course, also online businesses today are collecting a wealth of consumer data and information, which is no doubt, exacerbating power imbalances between consumers and traders. So probably not many consumer advocates would be aware that Australia, together with Singapore and Japan, are leading a new initiative on e-commerce at the WTO. This initiative intends to include some new commitments on consumer protection, among other areas. So today's webinar, we want to look at questions such as what is the WTO and what is its role in e-commerce and consumer protection? What is being proposed by Australia and others in the latest negotiations? And what is the consumer movement's response and proposals for a fair and inclusive marketplace? And we're fortunate to be joined by some experts today. Our first speaker will be Amy Stuart, who is the Director of WTO e-commerce section at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Amy has been at DFAT for almost 10 years, I think, including a posting to Indonesia when I stalked you online. Prior to joining the public service, Amy worked as a lawyer in private practice. And we will then hear from Alan Kirkland, our CEO of Choice. Of course, Alan needs no introduction to a consumer advocate audience. But in addition to Alan's role with Choice, he sits on the board of Consumers International, the peak body for consumer advocacy globally. CI does a lot of work in international trade issues. So Alan will share us that perspective as well. And then following the presentations, we will have an opportunity for Q&A. So please feel free to pop questions in the chat, and I will ask them at the end, or I'll also moderate questions from the audience. You can pop your videos on if you prefer and ask them yourself, but you're very welcome to ask any questions that you like. So I'll pass now over to Amy.
Thanks so much, Jared. And thanks very much for having me today. It's great to have this opportunity to talk about the WTO and to engage, I guess, with some important stakeholders. We're always really keen to get feedback as well in the last session or over email about, how we can work better with stakeholders and take on board stakeholder feedback. So, as Jared mentioned, I'd just like to start today by just giving a brief recap of what is the WTO and what it's doing on e-commerce. So the World Trade Organization came out of a post-World War II institution, really a recognition that after the war, we needed to have some rules of trade between nations. And that we were all, you know, economically interdependent on one another, and that trade and economic relationships could also have strategic consequences. So from that core principle, a range of WTO agreements were negotiated. First on goods, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, which is sort of self-explanatory, and then on services. So most of the rules on services and the General Agreement on Trade and Services were negotiated in the 90s. So they really predated a lot of the economic behaviour that we now have engaged in online. So their goal in terms of how e-commerce trade is still governed by those general services rules. There are still some relevant rules in terms of national treatment or most favoured nations, and not discriminating against one WTO member over another, and not discriminating in favour of your local enterprises. And all of those would apply equally to e-commerce organisations. And in particular, without getting too technical, there are also market access commitments under the WTO. So each member has made a positive list commitment of which sectors that it's going to open up to the world and allow other countries to engage in trade in. However, the most favoured nation commitment that you need to treat WTO members no less favourably than another, that applies horizontally, regardless of your market access commitment. So there's some still general principles that do apply, and there's a telecommunications annex rule that is still relevant to online trade that requires parties allowing data to flow, but parties actually disagree over whether, because that was sort of pre-internet or very early days of the internet, parties actually disagree over whether that TELS annex commitment applies to the internet. Australia certainly thinks it does, but really there was a vacuum and a space for the kind of modern digital trade transactions that we now have, and as Jared mentioned, have become even more commonplace during COVID as business becomes increasingly reliant on online goods and services trade. So in terms of that's sort of the problem analysis, I guess, you know, in the WTO agreements, there is really binding rules. There's also sort of recognition statements about norms around trade and things that people will try to promote, sort of shall endeavour style obligation. And, you know, a trade agreement is ratified in our parliament. So it's a treaty level obligation that is law under our domestic law, recognised in our domestic law. So it's, regardless of like how legally binding or how strong a commitment is worded, even if it's a shall endeavour or a recognition commitment, Australia would, you know, obviously our policy position is to comply with all of our trade commitments. And, you know, any commitments that we agree to in the e-commerce realm in this new negotiation, you know, certainly we will be seeing them as binding rules vis-a-vis all of our trading relationships with other countries. And the rules do impact on domestic law as well as our trading relationships, and I'll get into that in a minute. So as Jared mentioned, Australia has a leadership role of e-commerce negotiations at the WTO, with Singapore and Japan, we're the co-conveners of what is called the e-commerce joint statement initiative, which started in 2019 when 76 members launched the initiative in January 2019 in the margins of Davos. Our goal at that time was to achieve a high standard outcome that builds on the existing WTO agreements that I just spoke about, with a particular relevance in bringing them into the digital age. There are now 86 participants in the negotiation, including all the big players, so US, China, EU, Brazil, really good representation and really good constructive participation, notwithstanding the different positions on the digital economy of some of those big players. So the discussions focus on 6 main themes, including rules enabling e-commerce, openness, trust, cross-cutting issues, telecommunications, and market access. And so far we've agreed 6 articles, which doesn't sound like a lot, but with 86 countries, I assure you that's years of work. And so we're probably still around 18 months from conclusion, I would say. So to the sort of core question, I guess, in terms of what we're looking at doing in the WTO for consumer protection, privacy and data, as I know there would be a lot of interest in this room on those issues. On consumer protection, I'm pleased to report that the commitments we're looking at making in the WTO are on track to be Australia's most ambitious consumer protection commitments to date. So what we're currently discussing would be requiring countries to adopt or maintain measures to prescribe misleading, fraudulent and deceptive commercial activities that cause harm or potential harm to consumers engaged in e-commerce. It also requires countries to promote access to an awareness of consumer redress or recourse mechanisms, including for consumers contracting across borders. And the EU has also proposed rules around, some quite ambitious rules around information pertaining to goods and services given to consumers, including terms and conditions, as well as a commitment on product safety. That's sort of new to our trade practice, but although we haven't finalised those elements yet, Australia is supportive of that. I just want to sort of take a pause though, because this is probably the bit of most interest to some of the stakeholders in the room, and sort of draw out what we mean by commitments on consumer protection here. You know, Australian consumers are always going to primarily be protected by Australian consumer protection law, or the domestic law of other countries. What we're talking about doing here in international trade terms is setting some guardrails, a basic framework, with the purpose being that in some countries globally, because this is a global standard, there are so few guardrails that it's actually impossible to do meaningful trade, or for our consumers to participate in meaningful trade. So it's what we're not trying to do is have a prescriptive rule that puts all the requirements of our consumer protection regime on Côte d'Ivoire. What we're trying to do is set up a global agreement about what are the core requirements here to have a basic consumer protection regime so that we can trade with your country. And so moving on to privacy, I'm sure we can draw that out sort of more in the Q&A, and I have some sort of examples. Moving on to privacy. So there's a lot of different views. Privacy is one of the biggest hot button issues in the WTO in terms of how we're going to deal with it. And, you know, people might be surprised by different parties' positions on this. Just because you have a really strong privacy regime doesn't mean that you necessarily agree to the strongest rule on privacy in the WTO. And for example, Australia and the EU has a different position, not just in the WTO, but in our bilateral negotiations as well. Australia would like to see a positive commitment on privacy, that is, a commitment to have a privacy regime the same way I've just described for consumer protection, whereas the EU prefers the privacy provision to just be a carve out from the data and other obligations in the agreement. Of course, the EU is globally known for GDPR, and it's really strong, you know, it sees privacy as a fundamental human right to privacy. And yet they do take that sort of different position on the role of privacy in a trade agreement. So I'm sure there'll be questions about that as well. Australia and the US, Japan, Singapore have a sort of a similar type privacy commitment. And, you know, again, it's really just about guardrails. We don't think you need a privacy specific carve out to the agreement. We think that there's a range of general exceptions, including legitimate public policy exceptions to the data rules that cover, that carve out the space for countries to freely regulate in relation to privacy. But because the EU, you know, you can understand that GDPR has been raised by a lot of business groups, and so you can understand that sensitivity for them in terms of wanting even more clarity that they're not going to get into any issues with their domestic regime. So it's a big issue to work through. The EU and the US obviously have very different views on how to reflect both data and privacy in the agreement, and we haven't fixed it. But I guess what I would say in terms of Australia's objectives is that we will have full right to regulate privacy in our jurisdiction, both for our current measure, but also, as you probably all know, Australia is currently undergoing a review of its privacy laws. I don't have a looking glass into kind of how that will end up, but I've seen that Choice and some other consumer organisations have written submissions to that privacy review. And, you know, you can see on the website for the Attorney General's Department, I think hundreds of submissions to the privacy review. And it seems to me that Australia's privacy law, you know, speaking personally, is going to only get stronger over time. And we're very comfortable that our trade rules won't impede on the ability to move in that direction, whether it be closer towards GDPR style protection. That's very much at the forefront of our thinking when we negotiate data rules. So to data. Again, what we're trying to do when we so-called data rules in the WTO is not a prescriptive approach for how countries should be managing data, including consents to use consumer data. Really, these rules, they started in the TPP and they were a response to countries. So what we have is two basic data rules. One is a commitment for countries to allow data to flow across borders, and another one not to require data localization, which is the use only of servers in that country when you're conducting business. So those rules were both created with a real eye on obstructions that would be put in place in countries to restrict businesses from obviously transferring data, and this sense of data protectionism, that countries were really trying to control all the data in their jurisdiction. So it was really a response to that rather than from a privacy or a security standpoint, which was the goal of those rules, to now enable, because it's a trade agreement, to enable businesses to trade freely across borders. And what I will say of that, even though I've described it as a rule, primarily aimed at allowing businesses to trade, obviously that has a consumer effect, because Facebook and Google are always going to be able to do their best to understand really complex and onerous data rules and centralized data rules. Who it's much harder for is all the smaller players in the system. So when you have really onerous and obstructive data rules, my view would be that's removing consumer choice. It's even more centralized power in the hands of a few, and that's not good for global trade, but it's also not good for the consumers and consumer costs, because any small businesses that can operate in that environment, it adds to their cost in terms of where they're, the options available to them to store their data. And then there's one more sort of rule that I would consider a data rule, which is a commitment basically for governments not to take the source code of a company just as a condition for that company operating in its territory. So source code is the ones and zeros. That rule is also something that we're being very delicate about in the, with a view on consumer protection, but also just general regulation of the future. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a recent ACCC case against a travel site aggregator, where the travel site was misrepresenting how their algorithm worked in terms of the ranking and who it gave priority. I think we've all been suspicious of this type of activity for a long time. And in some instances, you will need the source code. Our regulators will need access to the source code to protect consumers. In these, if the company is misrepresenting how its algorithm works, sometimes we will need that power. And so we're really careful. While on the one hand, we think that some countries are misusing that power, and any company that has a good product in its jurisdiction, they're trying to require them handing over the source code to government as a condition of doing business in that territory. Obviously, we don't want to encourage that, but we also think it's really important as AI and source code becomes a bigger part of our economy, for critical infrastructure, but also for basic consumer protection and market, competition purposes, that we retain that regulatory kind of power for oversight. Then the final piece on data is government access to data, which is really a new and emerging discipline that we personally, Australia hasn't agreed to rules on before, but we're seeing increasingly worrying trends, including in our region, of governments using business data essentially for their own purposes, including authoritarian governments, and really centralizing that, which, when you extrapolate that out, is really taking the internet from being a public good, closer to being a government resource. And I think all consumers, all citizens, politically, are worried about that in certain contexts. Look, will we solve that problem in the JSI? Probably not. But again, it's about what norms can we set? How can we start that conversation globally in setting some basic standards to kind of discourage as much as we can that kind of behavior, which is, scary from a political as well as an economic standpoint. So I'm not sure, I've probably talked for too long already. In addition to consumer protection, I'll just quickly say that there are also some rules in relation to unsolicited commercial electronic messaging, which we often have in our FTAs. As Jared mentioned, I lived in Indonesia, and every time I walked into a mall in Indonesia, my phone would start exploding with messages from Dunkin' Donuts. It really starts to impede your ability to use your phone and your computer for genuine commerce and work. when you don't have basic spam laws. So that's another commitment that we're looking to introduce, as well as some cybersecurity commitments that are likely to be more on the sort of cooperation information sharing side. But I know that's still, you know, a really important aspect for consumers and, you know, businesses as well, I guess, in terms of impeding trade. I might leave it there just because I feel like I've talked for a really long time, but happy to take questions, and I'll hand over now to Alan. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Amy. That was fascinating, and really appreciate the kind of openness in talking through some of those issues and where Australia's position and some of the other countries' positions are at the moment. Thanks to CFA for the invitation to present today. Good to see some friends watching. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in the inner west of Sydney. I'm wearing, as Stuart said at the start, more my Consumers International hat today. So for those of you who don't know Consumers International, it's our international peak organisation. It's a small organisation in terms of staff, based mostly in London, although we've got some people spread around other countries in the world as well. And it's existed since 1959 and played 1960, I think, and played a very big role in a number of, I guess, putting the consumer voice into the development of a number of international statements and agreements. So things like the UN guidelines on consumer protection, which of course were revised about 5 years ago, various G20 statements. There's often before the G20, depending on who the host nation is, a consumer dialogue hosted by the finance minister in the relevant country, and CI has often been a partner in those conversations. The OECD's principles on financial consumer protection, all of these things CI has played a significant role in. It's got over 200 members in over 100 countries, and these are people, I guess, just as Amy was talking about the different levels of consumer protection, that's what we see in the CI member base. So we have people in countries that have no consumer protection legislation at all, other countries that might have legislation, but there's no effective enforcement. There aren't well-resourced regulators with appropriate powers. And then others that have quite well-developed consumer protection regimes. And of course, those economies have quite varying degrees of engagement in e-commerce as well. So CI's aim is to represent all of those views and voices across the world, and to try and influence the development of a general statement that can lift standards of consumer protection for consumers using e-commerce in countries across the world, and obviously often using e-commerce to shop across borders. CI, a little while ago, put out 8 key asks for this process, and I'll just briefly speak to those. I'm just going to present in order to do that. That should be coming up shortly. So the first one is to put consumers at the heart of the deal. I guess this is something that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in individual clauses, but essentially it was an ask. So there should be a consumer protection chapter or section in the agreement, and or in the statement. And in terms of the work that's already happening, you can see from what Amy said that that's something that has been picked up. There is already work that's quite well developed around the consumer protection chapter. The second one is informed choice. And this is one, as Amy said, the EU has taken this up quite strongly. Obviously, as consumer organisations, we don't think that providing information at the point of sale is the answer to all problems. In fact, I think we've learned in Australia that often it's quite flawed. But we'd like to see a commitment that at least some basic levels of information should be available on things like if you're signing up to a subscription service, how long will it last for, what are the terms, how can you unsubscribe, who you're actually buying from and where are they based, and what are your rights if something goes wrong. And finally, some commitments around ensuring that consumer reviews are truthful, can be trusted and are transparent. The next area is around access and inclusion. So ensuring that the needs of different types of consumers are considered. And obviously, this is particularly important in e-commerce because if electronic tools are not designed in the right way, they can exclude entire groups of consumers. So that, you know, goes to basic issues like font selection and colour selection. We see that reflected in Australia effectively through our Disability Discrimination Act, but we think it's an particularly important issue for e-commerce, as well as ensuring that there are measures to protect younger consumers. The next one, an obvious one, which is about redress, and Amy's already spoken to this briefly, but it's effectively ensuring that your rights are protected when you're using e-commerce. Basic things like it should be clear that you've made an agreement to buy something, you should receive a receipt, payment systems should be safe, and you should have redress, the ability to return something that's defective, receive a refund, and access to other means of resolving disputes. And then product safety, an obvious one, but that products should not be sold if they're unsafe. Obviously, that's something we're yet to get to in the Australian consumer law, but it is reflected in the laws of a number of countries. That products when they're sold should include information about safe use, including appropriate warnings, and that authorities should cooperate around global product recalls of unsafe products. Data protection, I won't pause too much on this one. We flagged as part of CI's commitments that we were seeking. Obviously, that's been picked up in different chapters, not necessarily in the consumer protection chapter. I don't think we really mind where that comes through, but it's ensuring appropriate protection of personal data and a degree of consumer control over consumer data with appropriate enforcement. International cooperation, so that we have regulators cooperating across borders. I think in Australia, our ACCC and ASIC are actually very good at this, but it's about ensuring that other countries' regulators are also cooperating around cross-border enforcement, but also around things like product safety. And finally, transparent and inclusive negotiations. This is more a process call than a content call, but wanting to see negotiations where it's possible to have dialogues like this, where civil society voice, particularly consumer organisations in our case, can actually have dialogue with the countries involved in negotiations around our views and exchange views on what should be included. I'll just stop sharing now. So in terms of progress, I think Amy's obviously been in a much better position to update you on that, but I guess from the things we've seen from leaked, you often get leaked documents through this process, and there were some leaked late last year that showed some pretty good progress on some of those issues around being able to make an informed choice, on access to redress, requiring traders to act in good faith, and the need for cooperation across countries. We had been a little bit concerned about product safety, and I think Amy sort of reflected that's still an issue that's being discussed. But it's good to see that Australia's, you know, seeing the merits of including a clause on product safety, because we see that as particularly important. And I would say as well, I mean, CI continues to talk to the negotiators and people involved from a range of countries, but we've also, besides this conversation with Amy, had the opportunity to meet with the head of the Australian mission to the WTO. That was Choice, along with some of the representatives of Consumers International and one of the European organisations, to put forward the views on a number of these issues. I think that's been quite helpful. So I might pause there, just to give you a sense of, I guess, some of the key priorities for the international consumer movement, bearing in mind, as I've said, we're trying to achieve an agreement that will actually do something to lift standards of consumer protection for people coming from a really diverse range of economies with really diverse approaches and degrees of, I guess, sophistication around consumer protection at the moment. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Alan, and thank you, Amy. That's a very great overview, both of you know, where things are at in the negotiations and what they may cover eventually, but also the perspectives of the consumer movement. That's very helpful. Just a reminder that if you've got questions, I hope people can use the chat, or please, you know, feel free to turn on your video and unmute and ask questions. We're very happy for that to happen as well. But maybe to kick things off, if I kind of ask a couple of questions. My first question may be to you, Amy. I mean, Alan's sort of, I think, principles that he worked through there are really very helpful. I mean, to what extent issues like Alan's sort of top of mind for this negotiation? Is there a sort of a transparency that the department or others involved can sort of respond to each of those points and be saying, yes, this is what we're doing in that area, or perhaps, you know, we'll look to do this in the future?
You know, it's a really good question. Thanks, Jared. I mean, listening to the presentation, I had obviously seen that submission before, those principles, but as I sort of ticked it off during your presentation, Alan, I thought like my report card's looking pretty good right now. You know, I sort of addressed a lot of those elements, I hope, in my presentation, as you mentioned. Look, the one on transparency, I should have mentioned this. Alan's right that the text is online as it looked in December. Unfortunately, the WTO Secretariat didn't publish it. It was published on a third-party website. Look, as a co-convener, we're in a difficult position because Australia's delegation position is that the text should be transparent, it should be publicly available. I mean, and our argument is that by the time you make it available to 86 participants, including some of whom, you know, have joint missions with, you know, different organizations in Geneva, and there's quite a membrane there, you know, there's no, like, this is not a secret negotiation. And so, you know, we should be showing leadership on this, you know, because we're getting subtracted points, even though, you know, it's quite public. So I think that, you know, we've certainly been encouraging the membership to take leadership and to consistently publish the consolidated text. We haven't won that argument. There are some countries who never publish their treaty negotiations, and we just haven't been able to get them over the line, speaking frankly. But what we are trying to do, you know, in addition to the text being, you know, pretty widely available, what we are trying to do more formally is have discussions like this one, like Alan, you mentioned you had in Geneva, and be just as available as we can to talk through the substantive issues and be quite frank about Australia's positions on things. We also, you know, happy to put anyone that's interested on the list. We have sort of regular stakeholder forums in Geneva, like more generally, not just focused on consumer protection. And get different organisations. There's always a different theme, and people can present at them directly to the negotiators. And then on the website, after each plenary, the WTO Secretariat does provide an update on what was discussed. Look, it's not ideal, but we're trying to do sort of everything we can, I guess, recognising that this is really important for Australian stakeholders, but also for the WTO. I mean, we think that I sort of didn't really discuss the value of plurilateral negotiating for the future of the WTO, but we think it's really important for the WTO to be able to show that it can make rules in the modern environment, and that we can continue to have a strong rulemaking function. And so we see this negotiation as crucial to that. And then how we interact with, you know, the public and all of our stakeholders in that is also, you know, a WTO strategic issue for how people see the future of the WTO and its credibility. So we've got that very much front of mind. International cooperation, I'll just quickly tick off a couple of the ones that I didn't mention much. In terms of that principle, that is included in the consumer protection module. So I think you'll be happy with that. I mean, the one thing which Jared and I have discussed before, which I think we will get marked down on, is this, you know, element of sort of website design, fonts, verification of young users. I think, unfortunately, we're going to be reliant on domestic measures to regulate that, because there is just we just can't sort of get global consensus on those type of measures. Everybody's measures are so different. It was really hard to get consensus on having some of these measures at all. And those elements obviously are really, if we look across the sort of 86 membership, really hard for some that, you know, didn't have the broader measures in the first place. So you might mark me down on that one, but otherwise I think we've got, you know, a really strong coverage of the priorities. And as I said, it's in, you know, and as Alan has acknowledged, it's not just in the consumer protection module, but I think elements of it, because the design of a lot of the articles is to enable simpler more effective, more efficient trade. So for example, things that you wouldn't even necessarily think have a consumer focus, like e-payments, e-invoicing, you know, we still think that that will really improve digital trade, trust in the digital environment, and make things easier for consumers going forward, even though it might not be sort of the direct link. I think that, you know, we've got a good package as a whole.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of consumer interest in secure and safe e-payments systems. You know, I think over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen a huge increase in scam and fraudulent activity happening online. And it really underscores, I think, the need for these payment systems to be, you know, treated as utilities and a public good, that they're safe places for people to transact. So it's good to see a focus there as well. I had another question. I can't see any others putting up questions, so I'm going to keep on going. Just around, you mentioned, I think there's 86 countries involved in these negotiations, but it's my understanding the WTO has many more countries than that. So can you tell us a bit about what the implications of that is? You know, this seems to be negotiations that are within the scope of WTO, but slightly different because it doesn't include everyone. And can you just explain that process a little bit for us?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. And sorry, I've been doing this particular negotiation for so long that I skip over some of the existential questions sometimes. So the JSI, it's called a joint statement initiative for exactly that reason. We don't have consensus of every WTO member to proceed with e-commerce negotiations. And in particular, India and South Africa don't see a need to have rule negotiations on e-commerce. They are participants in the WTO e-commerce work program, which includes discussions in various WTO committees that include all members, including Australia, and we're also a supporter of that work program. And they think that's the avenue for progressing these discussions. We do think there's a need for rules, and 86 countries think that. And we, you know, it's called plural, when it's not everybody negotiating, it's called plurilateral rulemaking in the WTO, and the WTO has a long history of it. In fact, all of the WTO agreements really at some point started with a group and then moved to broader consensus rulemaking. So that's certainly our goal, that we've got such a critical mass that we can negotiate a package, and then instead of having a conversation in the abstract about it becoming a broader WTO agreement with consensus of all members, we have a package where we can explain, and it's sort of not this black box of what, there's a lot of rhetoric around rich countries tricking poor countries into rules they don't understand. Once you've actually got stuff on paper, our hope is that we can make it what's called, there's no discussion on the actual legal instrument yet, no agreement, sorry, but there is discussion. And one of the options would be an Annex 4 agreement, which sits with the other WTO agreements, and it's voluntary to join. And if you join, you take on the responsibilities and the obligations and you get the benefits. But if you don't, you don't. It's a reciprocal agreement, but it still sits within the WTO architecture. So you could, for example, take disputes if people are in breach. That is one option, which we think everybody should be supportive of, even if they don't want to join themselves. There are various other options, including reference papers. There's also 3 plurilateral negotiations right now at the WTO: e-commerce, services, domestic regulation, and investment. And between those 3 negotiations, 110 members are participating. So we think that it is a really broad support for the concept of plurilateral rulemaking and the legality of it. And we're trying to be as inclusive as possible. Our negotiation, the initial statement said the participation of as many members as possible, and taking into account the unique interests of LDCs and developing countries. And that's certainly the way we do business, which is part of why transparency and inclusivity in these negotiations is so important, so that we can get as many members as possible to join and get sort of maximum mandate, I guess, for eventually embedding this in the WTO agreements to the extent possible. Hope that answers your question. It's very complex.
Great. It is very complex, but it's helpful to have some insight to it. So thanks very much. There is a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll read those out. So can you tell us a bit more, if you can answer them, can you tell us a bit more about the differences between the EU and the US approach to regulating cross-border data flow?
Yes, I could talk about this all day. So the US style of data rules that they really championed in TPP, though they subsequently left that negotiation. The two rules, so allowing data to cross borders and not requiring localization in a local server. They're sort of two sides of the same coin. The EU's position in its negotiation is that data localization is the only piece of that matters. We don't need a more general rule prohibiting countries from blocking flows across borders. We only need this data localization thing because that's really the bulk of the measures that take place in real life. And they think everything else is sort of somewhat theoretical. I suspect they also see an interaction or a potential interaction with the data flows rule and their privacy regime, although I don't accept that. In my negotiations with them bilaterally, I think it would be very easy to agree data rules because there is great public policy exceptions in those rules that would easily cover off GDPR, but that's the EU position, to just have a data localization rule only and not a more general flows rule. And both of our rules are quite future-proof. They're quite general rules that say, you shouldn't block data flows going across border and you shouldn't require data localization as a condition for doing business in the territory. The EU has a quite specific list of all the data localization measures that it prohibits in its data localization rules. So it's a difference in architecture. I think we can bridge that gap in the WTO, but it'll be one of those sort of landing zone issues that happens at the very end. And there are a bunch of countries negotiating bilaterally in the meantime that hopefully will help that process, including, Australia is negotiating with the EU. I think there's sort of a middle ground, a pathway that we can find. So in response to sort of, are we with the US? Our trade practice, yes, is that TPP style rule, but Australia is very pragmatic. I would never want to explain to a minister or to the public that I couldn't agree a rule because I wanted it to be formatted in a certain way, notwithstanding the substantive issues I've just raised. But, really we've got to have rules that that are commercially meaningful, that try to address these things. But it is also an agreement with 86 countries, and I think that means we may not all get our favourite template that we normally do in our bilateral agreements.
Thanks, Amy. And that's helpful. And I think you've sort of made clear that other question there as well. I had another question that a colleague asked me to ask prior to today's event, so I'll mention that now. Goes to having sufficient information when buying things online as a consumer to help make those informed choices. There is rules around buying when you buy goods in person around, for example, food, nutritional information, ingredients, allergens, net weight, these sort of things. Is an expectation out of this that we should set the same information online that we do in store, both with those broader information, but also with price information, price per unit of measure and those sort of things?
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. So the short answer is yes. We are negotiating a commitment to have equivalent protections in the online environment as we have in the physical environment. And then the EU measures that I talk about do specifically also address this concept of complete, accurate and transparent information on goods and services. Those second bits aren't, well, neither is, completely finalized, but there are different positions on that EU proposal in terms of information on goods and services. As I mentioned, we're supportive of that. It's a bold new step in our trade practice, if I can say. But, we think it's important for the reasons that you've outlined, and including that, we undertook to do a sort of a high ambition agreement in the WTO that will support the digital economy. So we'll see how we go. I don't want to promise success, but we're certainly going to try.
Great, thank you. Any other questions people have got? Alan, I think you've just gone off mute.
I might jump in, Amy. So you're talking about that being a bold new step. I think it would be the same if there was something that made it in around product safety, wouldn't it? Would this be, I think you might have said in your opening statement that that product safety isn't explicitly addressed in other trade agreements. Is that right? Would that be a sort of significant shift in Australia's trade policy as well?
Yeah, it would. And that's in the same sort of batch of proposals. I actually think it's always a line call with whether stuff should be covered in your domestic regime versus in a trade agreement. Is it really blocking? Is it so bad in terms of in terms of product safety rules in other jurisdictions, that it's becoming a trade obstruction. You know, we're falling on the side of, let's say it is, but it is one of those ones where, you know, reasonable countries can disagree, and some people think we shouldn't be sort of micromanaging how different, you know, it's very different in some parts of our region, you know, different product safety laws. I think, you know, hopefully we can come out with a principles-based rule that everybody can be happy with, that sort of signals the forward direction for some of those countries that still have a long way to go, and that we can use as a tool for advocacy with them, without them feeling like, you know, this is a cut and paste of a certain, you know, jurisdiction's framework for dealing with these things. And that sort of recognises the importance of it, is my best guess. Yeah.
No, that's really good to hear. Thanks.
And maybe on a similar vein, I'll ask one more, Amy, about, you said, I think in your earlier statement, around requirements about promoting access to redress. And I think dispute resolution and redress sometimes is something that really worries people when they buy things online from overseas. You know, and we actually, you know, as a consumer organisation advising people about their rights, yes, you might have rights in domestic law, but if the trader's overseas, you know, good luck enforcing that. So yeah, can you tell us a bit more about perhaps what might be contemplated in that area?
Yeah, so again, let me just get the relevant bit up on redress. But again, we're talking about, because of the diversity of the membership, you know, a sort of a commitment to promote access to redress or recourse mechanisms without a prescriptive obligation as to what they need to look like. It's still, you're not going to, an individual consumer in Australia is not going to have the right to sue a company in Indonesia as a basis, you know, under this treaty. So what can happen instead is that if we feel like a particular country isn't giving faith to that article, or they're not heading in the right direction, we can have a policy dialogue about that, and, you know, link it to trade and the you know, the economic opportunities that it will create for that country. But yeah, I just sort of want to caution in terms of immediately, you know, providing redress in all these jurisdictions. It's sort of one step removed to that. But I think as a global, you know, as a global agreement, I don't want to sort of use this as a cop out, but you know, it will be impressive to get the one global standard that we can point to and advocate with all of our trading partners. I mean, I think it's easier to get a bilateral commitment on some of these things that you can discuss specific measures, but when you're setting a global standard, I still think there'll be value in that, in signalling that countries should be moving in that direction on redress and recourse mechanisms. But yeah, it's not going to be an overnight shift. It's more about building norms and advocacy.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. I'll just check if there's any other questions that people want to ask at this stage. Look, if not, we might bring our webinar to a conclusion, and just, thank you very much, both Amy and Alan, for your presentations, and particularly Amy for your willingness to be so open and transparent about these discussions. It is really helpful to consumer advocates. We will be sharing this recording with consumer advocates, so more people get to see it as well. So yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and keep an eye out on the CFA website about future opportunities for our events. All right, thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks so much,
Thanks,
everyone.
Jared. Thanks, Amy.